I just tried to make this video, but I was brutally and incessantly interrupted. Has anybody ever been interrupted, and doesn't that anger you sometimes? So now I have to reread this half of this thing. Okay. Valmy, 1792. Valmy signified a new age in warfare, one in which ideology would be the fuel of conflict. When the revolutionaries of the untrained French citizens' army were ranged against the well-drilled Franks of the Prussians, it was their high morale that proved the decisive factor in the victory that day. Although the Battle of Valmy was more of a psychological victory than an outright military one. The citizen armies raised by the French revolutionary governments fought many battles and wars, something of an irony for a regime that was born out of idealism and the desire for international fraternity. Liberty, equality, fraternity, or death, declared a French soldier at Pontoise in 1794, a slogan which made it clear that anyone who disagreed with the revolution was considered an enemy, pitting France against the rest of Europe. The French revolutionary armies supposedly brought freedom from oppression, but they did so at the point of the bayonet. In previous eras, wars had usually been fought for political advantage and material gain. This remained true in the 1790s too, but now there was the additional factor of ideological self-righteousness. In this conviction that identifies these wars as marking the beginning of modern warfare. Furthermore, successive French revolutionary governments became more and more extreme under the stresses of conflict, so much so that war became a method of maintaining their increasingly desperate grip on power. In this sense, the military and ideological campaigns of Hitler and Stalin can be said to have roots in the French revolutionary regimes of the 1790s. Citizen soldiers. A revolution implies a break with the past, but very often the new government simply makes much more efficient use of the previous regime's power structures. According to Alexis de Tocqueville, in his analysis of the French Revolution, the only change is that the centralization of power in France has become far more conspicuous now that all the relics of the past have been pruned away. From the 17th century, France had been steadily transformed into a powerful bureaucratic state run from Paris, and with increased control over its people. The state could put massive armies into the field to enforce its political will. This continued to be the case, in fact, even more so during the rule of the revolutionary governments. Except that whereas in the past soldiers had been hired or impressed into service, they were all now free men and had been persuaded to fight, hence the birth of the citizen soldier. I have no pity for the enemies of my country, wrote a cannoneer in the French Revolutionary Army in Caen in 1793. They have spilled and continue to spill the blood of my brothers, who all demand vengeance, and those who have played the part of counter-revolutionaries deserve death at angry hands. Vengeance and fear motivated these political soldiers, and they in turn roused other, less politically involved comrades until a whole nation was roused in anger. All the government had to do was direct these men towards the perceived enemy, and the spirit of fury of these citizen soldiers would do the rest. Or at least that was the idea. Suspecting that the upheaval of the revolution had weakened France, some neighboring countries considered it a good time to come to the aid of the French royal family. In August 1792, Prussia and its German-speaking allies invaded, threatening terrible punishment to the citizens of Paris if they harmed their king. The reaction of the Parisian mob was to storm the palace of the Tuileries and take the royal family prisoner. Fear and anger ruled the streets, and not surprisingly, rabble-rousing politicians believed that enemies within should be the first to die. Rabble-rousing politicians. Enemies within should be the first. In the towns, declared Fabre d'Eglantine, let the blood of traitors be the first holocaust to liberty. so that in advancing to meet the common enemy, we leave nothing behind to disquiet us. When the city's guardian fortress of Verdun fell to the Prussian-led force, the revolutionaries vented their anger on more than 1,000 prisoners, both political and criminal, who were hacked to death in the event known as the September Massacres. The government in Paris might have been expected to gain confidence in the belief that such fervor could be directed at its foreign enemies, but the army of revolutionaries had already proved unstable. In an earlier clash with the Austrians on the border with the Austrian Netherlands, the poorly trained and organized French force had fled. Revolutionary generals had been promoted only to be put on trial and then executed amid scenes of paranoia that would also afflict totalitarian armies in the 20th century. However, commitments in other foreign theaters affected the Prussian army and its allies. Austria could not field as many men as it would have liked for the invasion of France, while the German army that advanced into France was only 80,000 men strong, which was half what its commander, the Duke of Brunswick, had hoped for. And the numbers continued to fall throughout the campaign. Brunswick had considered linking up with other armies on the French frontier, but news emanating from Paris about the bloody anarchy there persuaded him to march his force directly on the French capital. General Dumouriez took the command amid chaos afflicting the French defenses and marched his army of the north away from the frontier with Belgium and southwards towards Sedan, the Argonne forest giving him a natural barrier between his army and the Prussians. Brunswick, though, outmaneuvered the French, penetrated the Argonne, and forced Dumouriez to take up a position in the southern part of the forest area. Brunswick's caution in following up his advance allowed Dumouriez to receive further reinforcements of more than 25,000 men under Kellerman to bring the total strength of his army up to 36,000. So 25,000 men to 36,000, having only some 34,000 men directly under his command. Brunswick wanted to link up with the Austrians from the north, but a false report that Dumouriez was withdrawing encouraged Brunswick to try to cut off the French retreat on the road to Chalon and force the French into battle near the village of Valmy. Vive la nation. Brunswick's advance guard moves towards the French through a thick fog. Out of the gloom came the roar of a cannonade. Kellerman's French reinforcements on the hill of Huron found themselves in the front line against the Prussians. Despite the artillery fire, Brunswick's force pressed on towards the road where it came under more cannon fire. An artillery duel followed, but no decisive effect on the advance. As the fog and gunsmoke lifted, Brunswick placed his main army opposite Valmy, but the view that materialized did not please him. The French were well positioned and in no hurry to leave the battlefield. They did not look like the anarchic rabble that he was expecting. Nevertheless, Brunswick ordered his men to begin the advance. As they did so, Kellerman understood that aggression was perhaps the only quality his soldiers possessed above everything else. He placed his hat, bearing the revolutionary cockade, on his sword and shouted, "Vive la nation." With that, his men were triggered into wildly roaring, "Vive la nation, vive la France, vive notre général." And it was one of those decisive moments when armies ponder whether to fight or flee. The French did not run, and so Brunswick lost his nerve and halted the advance. An artillery duel then took place where Brunswick agonized over what to do next. In council with his officers, he decided not to proceed with the battle, and as darkness fell, the French left the battlefield bolstered by the knowledge that they had stared down the great foreign threat. It was a bizarre victory, with little blood actually shed, but the psychological impact of it was enormous. It demonstrated that morale was perhaps the most important aspect of any army, more so even than training or weapons, and the French Revolutionary Army possessed bucket loads of it, given birth to a new form of ideology-driven warfare. The poet Goethe was with the Prussian army at Valmy, and he perceived the importance of events, consoling his vowed comrades thus: "From here and today there begins a new epoch in the history of the world, and you can say that you were there." Prussia's Colonel von Massenbach similarly felt that it was a significant moment. The French revolutionaries have come through their baptism of fire. The 20th of September has given the world a new shape. It is the most important day of the century. Perhaps the Prussians were dignifying their own performance with hyperbole. Napoleon Bonaparte called it merely the affair at Valmy, one in which it had been the artillery that had proved its worth. In the initial campaigns of the War of the Revolution, he concluded, France always excelled in the artillery. What is clear is that after Valmy, France's revolutionaries felt secure enough to proceed with the execution of the royal family and then embark on a series of foreign wars that would see France conquer Belgium, the Netherlands, and Switzerland, along with parts of Germany and Italy, and establish a victorious engine of war that Napoleon would subsequently inherit and use to become master of the whole of Europe. Without the French Revolutionary Army, there would never have been the Napoleonic Wars. It cannot be said, however, that all these subsequent battles engaged in by the French were victorious. An ideologically driven army is strong in confrontation, but if its opponents do not budge, then its own morale can collapse quickly. For example, at Hungen in March 1793, Dumouriez's army suffered a rout, leaving more than 2,000 casualties and only 40 injured Austrians. So there you go. Everybody wanted to talk about, everybody especially today is in the current events talks about, it's going to be a civil war, it's going to be a revolution. But nobody ever talks about France, and people are like, you know what, America's a lot like Rome. And you go, oh, we're doing revolution. Are we doing a revolution? America had one of them, right? And we did well in that one. But France had has had an infinite amount of revolutions. Kind of same thing with Mexico. They have a lot of revolutions too. But there you go. So you had citizen army. People persuaded to join the army rather than, a king's, demand or impressing upon them. Not very well trained, high morale, and they had victory, to where the Germans were bogged down because they were split. They were having foreign wars already. They fielded an army to go assist the crown in France, and the revolutionaries there kind of went to a draw with artillery, and then had a moment, a morale moment, and the Germans backed down. So, and Napoleon was in there. Napoleon! All right. I guess I'll do another one later. Unless I get brutally interrupted again.